You are listening to KZSC's Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcone. Today I'm here with Roberto Lovato, a nationally recognized journalist and prolific writer whose work focuses on some of the most pressing issues facing our world: immigration, the drug wars, national security, and climate change. Roberto Lovato's writings have appeared in a wide range of news and magazine outlets, including The Nation magazine, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The San Francisco Chronicle, and Mother Jones. His work popularized the term Juan Crow, a reference to a system of surveillance and control of immigrants to the U.S. that resonates with Jim Crow segregation laws. Lovato currently works out of the San Francisco's Writers Grotto and recently completed a 3-year visiting scholar position with the UC Berkeley Center for Latino Policy Research. I've invited him here on the show to talk about the current state of U.S. immigration politics and about his recent writings focused on Central American countries, specifically El Salvador and Nicaragua. Welcome, Roberto, to KZSC's Voces Críticas. As you well know, the subject of immigration has been frequently fraught and contradictory. The narrative of, quote-unquote, we are a nation of immigrants erases the history of slavery and genocide. The narrative of U.S. national security criminalizes all immigrants arriving to the U.S., and so forth. How would you describe the current state of our national conversation with regards to immigration?
Well, the polite way to say would be that we're in flux, quote-unquote flux. I think the edgier way is that we're in deep waters, let us say, as far as where that flux is taking us. Are we a nation of immigrants? Okay, well, the question that precedes that is, are we a nation? Given that our work lives, our communications lives have been globalized, and the challenges that have been posed to the nation state structure itself. I travel all over the world for my work. I just came back from Catalonia, which is the, part of Spain where Barcelona is, where they have an independence move. They want to basically break off from Spain. Prior to that, I was in the Basque Country. They want to break off from Spain because they have historic claims that precede the Spanish state itself. And it's complicated. It really isn't just right wing and left wing. And I tend to like to put things in those boxes when possible for analytical and sometimes political purposes. But right now, all bets are off. So we're in flux about what is a nation. And so the people mostly paying the brunt of that are migrants. Migrants are kind of walking, talking symbols, I think, of the crisis that the world's unleashed. Within our lifetimes, something on the order of 300 million to 500 million people will be uprooted from their homelands, their cities, their rural communities, because of climate change. So I often try to tell people who are open to listening, some people just aren't open, but I often tell people, hey, do you want to understand President Barack Obama? 3 million deportations, 400,000 people jailed a year, jailing immigrant children. Well, it's climate change. Climate change is a major priority for the Pentagon to look at it as a, quote, national security issue. They've been looking at it for more than a decade, and they see it as a national security issue, which for them is not just a crisis, but it's an opportunity to justify militarizing our lives even more.
Well, you see this really clearly, the climate change and migration or forced migration in the case of Puerto Rico right now.
Absolutely. I was in Florida not too many months ago, and there's a lot of Puerto Ricans along the I-4 corridor, and potentially game-changing things for Florida and therefore for the nation, because Florida is such an important electoral state. But they come with citizenship. People don't understand why Barack Obama acted the way he did on immigration with all those deportations, jailing children and all that. Well, it has to do with climate change, because you have not just the United States, but nations in the northern hemisphere that is primarily responsible for the industrial pollution that created climate change, having to deal with the migrants who are from the southern part of the hemisphere, who are the most impacted by climate change, who are coming northward. So you have elites around the world, whether in Asia, Europe. I was just in Europe. I saw the wall in the Mediterranean that they're building, and the water literally, or the border walls here. You have the industrialized countries preparing for a migration that they themselves has unleashed, but they themselves don't want to respond to, because to respond to the crisis that brought about both climate change and the massive migration of hundreds of millions would require a restructuring of the capitalist system as we know it. So instead of doing that, let's just militarize the problem. Capitalism that has proven a failure, if only in terms of the destruction of the life-sustaining systems of the planet. How many species have to die or be extinct before we realize the failure of capitalism? Is it going to take the extinction of the human race itself? We may be broaching that question closer and closer unless we open our political imaginations to, kind of what I think a lot of millennial youth are seeing, which is a need to restructure away from capitalism. And as you can see in the polls that show, most U.S. youth sympathize with socialist thinking. All you young people out there, if you want to see a better world, you have to destroy the borders of the political imagination that tells you that your only options are Democrats and Republicans. If you stay there, you and your world are doomed. There's no question. We've already seen it. And so when you look at migrants, you really are looking at a scapegoat of epic proportions worldwide. Because you're seeing Donald Trump's worldwide. You're seeing migrants being scapegoated worldwide because the population of migrants is growing because of climate change. And the industrialized world doesn't want to accept that. So a lot of people here just tend to see, Obama's not as bad as Trump on immigration. It's a total falsehood in terms of killing migrants in the desert, in terms of pushing migrant bodies into jails, in terms of deporting migrant bodies. And we make the mistake when we talk about migration not to talk about the decline of whiteness. There's a direct correlation between the deindustrialization of the white United States from the 70s on, and, you're talking about industrial jobs leaving, steel towns in Pennsylvania, or agricultural farms, small farms being globalized out of existence in places like Arizona, or military bases being shut down by Bill Clinton in the 90s. All those losses of white jobs were kind of keeping white people at bay about this thing that Donald Trump is now capitalizing on. When we talk about immigration, we have to talk about it as an issue of whiteness as much as it is about anything else. And the degree to which we don't report like that, to which we don't write like that, to which we don't think like that, is the degree to which we're basically in a very fictionalized mythical discourse, a mythical debate around, one lie debating another lie, a liberal lie debating a right-wing lie.
In my class, we were just watching the documentary 13th, and the film shows how the kind of discourse around criminality, there is actually no duality. They're all on the same side, so there's no questioning of the tough on crime approach as always having to result in an increase in police presence or more prisons or more money to the Department of Justice or what have you. And so it becomes a battle between, in this case, the two GOP and the Democrats, which is they're on the same side. You were listening to Roberto Lovato, a nationally recognized journalist and writer addressing issues like immigration, the drug wars, national security, and climate change. Let's talk now about your writing about Central America, and I'm specifically referring to your work on unaccompanied minors. The reports make it seem very much like a contemporary phenomenon, but we know that's not true, that there are larger historical roots.
I met my first unaccompanied minors back in the 1980s. There was a war in El Salvador, and children were coming to the United States without their parents. Either their parents were here or their parents sent them. But you had these extremely poor children whose families had been literally fragmented by the bombs of war, the guns of war, the threat of war, the fact of war, and the economies, right? The globalization of the economy also fragments families, separates them. When you look at unaccompanied minors, you have to look at the other side of the equation, which are fragmented families.
You also write about the rates of violence in places like El Salvador. In one piece, you talk, for instance, about violence in comparison to Syria, and you use this language of, quote-unquote, war-torn countries. How useful or not is the metaphor of war when you're talking about violence in a place like El Salvador?
It's an excellent question because El Salvador, as much as any country, is a country caught in which both sides of the political spectrum are still trapped in working under war conditions, even though we're in a time of peace. But you have a violent situation in terms of the numbers that has surpassed the number of people killed per month during the war.
It's stunning.
Stunning, and especially when you consider what is it to be in El Salvador, having lived through the extreme violence of war, death squads, U.S.-supported government killing its own people. What is it to be in that environment of trauma, constant, 24/7 trauma? Have a moment where you sign a peace accord, hooray! You breathe a sigh of relief, only to wake up the next day, it's a new day with the gangs and the military and the police fighting it out. But I also question the utility of using the war frame to understand the situation, because to solve the problems that you're dealing with, you don't need the military. You need psychologists. You need counselors, job creation. economic restructuring, changed U.S. immigration foreign policy, some policing, lots of housing, and a lot of things to transition people into this new moment. But instead, you have the cookie-cutter solution being applied worldwide, mano dura, heavy-handed policing as a solution to our problems. And that's not just in El Salvador. The left, the FMLN, applied it just as badly as the right, sadly. And so the war frame around the issues of crime and violence in El Salvador, as described to me by a psychologist over there, is an utterly unhelpful frame, because if the leaders only know how to operate in terms of war, then their policies are going to reflect that. If the population perceives that the only way to solve a problem is through violence and war, then you're going to get, like you do right now, according to polls in El Salvador, almost or maybe even over a third of the population supporting using death squads against the gangs. Just wrap your head around that. And if you wrap your heart around that, it gets tragic, because those are basically fascist beliefs, fascist solutions to humanitarian crisis, to the failure of capitalism ultimately in El Salvador and in the Western Hemisphere and around the world, if you look at climate change.
You are listening to Roberto Lovato, a nationally recognized journalist and writer addressing issues like immigration, the drug wars, national security, and climate change. I now want to talk to you about your piece in The Nation in February 2018. This article was about the decline of Nicaragua's homicide rate. What I found very compelling about that piece is that you open and close it with an emotional response to being Salvadoran in neighboring Nicaragua. What was coming up for you emotionally to have that kind of response, and why you as a writer felt that emotion had to be shared?
You know, the more I write, the more emotional I'm getting. Running parallel with my age, I'm getting softer as a human being, I think, for many reasons. So I was in Nicaragua in a very vulnerable time. I'm writing a book about what makes young people, young men especially, turn sometimes into gang members and sometimes into extreme, even mass murdering gang members. You know, it's an exploration of the outside world, but it's also an exploration of my own life as somebody who was not in like a hardcore gang, but it was a little clique of friends in San Francisco, and then, you know, growing to watch the war end in El Salvador, and then the gang issue. Gangs that we were born and bred in California exported out. So, you know, I go in there to look at Nicaragua, which has this astonishingly low homicide rate, which is like at 6 per 100,000. Honduras is 51. El Salvador is in the 80s. Astonishing. In the United States, at 5. Why is this happening? So I was going there to explore this question. You go in and you're focused and you're a journalist and you're investigating, you're researching, you're talking to people. But then you stop and you're kind of tired and you just become yourself. I'm looking at the almond trees, feeling the warm summer night, tropical after the rain, looking at people walking around the streets, eating in open spaces in ways that I didn't see in El Salvador now. Women walking around neighborhoods like they can. And then suddenly I'm like, this feels like El Salvador. Because the people, the language is somewhat similar, the climate is similar, the flora, the fauna, the almond trees. But it wasn't the same, because in El Salvador, I hadn't felt like that in like 40 years. And that made me cry. And I cried for El Salvador. So that's why I started off that story. Went to Nicaragua to cry for El Salvador. Of course, now we got to cry for Nicaragua because it's a mess. You have a dictator duo in Daniel Ortega and his wife, the vice president. You have a legitimate opposition, but within this legitimate opposition, you have tens of millions of dollars in U.S. funding, which nobody wants to talk about. Like, I came back from a conference recently, and basically what they were saying there was, you can't question about U.S. funding because you're insulting the heroic young people. That really offends my journalistic sense, but also my moral, political instincts and sensibilities, because it's not like I have just landed on this hemisphere. I remember when Haiti, when I found out there was U.S. funding for youth programs, U.S. funding for media, U.S. funding for polls, USAID, the International Republican Institute, National Endowment for Democracy. And sure enough, suddenly you have these upheavals. We saw this in Honduras, funding for youth, funding for media, destabilizing what eventually became the coup of 2009. And I almost got killed for this in Venezuela. I went to do a story on a guy named Leopoldo Lopez, who was the person chosen by the U.S. basically to be the president of Venezuela. And I exposed the fact that he had ties to extreme, even fascistic people in Venezuela. I had a guy pull a gun on me. I saw funding for youth programs, and the youth were getting training in places like Cancun. And there was clandestine meetings. I found out about funding for media. I found out that there were these organizations that operate between, say, Washington and Hollywood, where you have, during the 2014 upheavals in Venezuela, you have an actor, a basically know-nothing actor like Jared Leto or Cher, Madonna, suddenly saying, hey, SOS Venezuela. Well, where's the SOS language come from? It came from the specific training of people like a guy named Gene Sharp and OTPOR, O-T-P-O-R. People can Google that, and you can see, even in the New York Times, there's reports of some of this activity, but, limited access. So I reported on all this. I got a death threat. I survived, came home, got a call from Agent Mike Ranger of the U.S. State Department. Hey, Mr. Lovato, we're concerned about your well-being. Hey, that's great, Agent Ranger, but you know what? I didn't report this. How do you know about this? I'm not at liberty to tell you, sir. He told me in this kind of Captain America voice. And I said, well, I'm not at liberty to keep talking with you. And that conversation ended. The magazines that I was writing for got threatened with lawsuits by quote-unquote human rights lawyers. This was like Democrat influence side of Washington. And so I then got a hit piece on me in the Washington Post. So all my journalist friends treat me like, not all of them, but a lot of them say, hey, man, you took a hit for the cause, man. When you get attacked in the Washington Post, you've proven your mettle. They were trying to destroy my journalistic career. I don't know if it worked. It may have worked. After that, I decided it was time to write my book. So I've been writing a book for the past few years and doing less journalism. We'll see if they were successful in destroying my journalistic thing. I was not born solely to be a journalist. I have a brown escapulario. I don't know how you say it in English. Scapulary. For me, a Catholic talisman that my mom gave me to protect me. My mom died in 2013, but she gave me this way before this, and this thing's taken me through all manner of threats. I've, by my own choice, made a life of touching the tiger where it's tender.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on to Voces Críticas today.
My pleasure. Thank you.